And the main model for that is, as we heard, we were going to hear about, is Texas. Texas, knowing about the problem that we saw in the State Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act approach, vague substantive standards, the inability to specify standards at all, got around that by saying we're not going to specify any standards. The doc can withdraw for any reason. We're not going to specify the reasons because we don't know how to specify them. He can withdraw for any reason, as long as his or her ethics committee agrees. It's what you might call a pure process approach. What's the process? You have to give the surrogate 48 hours notice of the ethics committee meeting. You hold the ethics committee meeting. The ethics committee reduces its decision to writing, gives that to the surrogate. At that point, the surrogate has 10 days to find another facility that's willing to provide the treatment that this facility doesn't want to provide. And there's no judicial review. The ethics committee is the forum of last resort. If you follow this process, you have immunity, criminal, civil, and disciplinary immunity. So just note how easy it is for a Texas physician to ascertain whether she qualifies for safe harbor protection, right? 48 hours, 10 days, these are measurable, concrete. To be really sure whether you're inside the safe harbor, in contrast to Tennessee or Delaware or California, where the standards are vague and you're not quite sure whether they're satisfied or not. So let me just illustrate this real quick by walking a case through the Texas process. This is a high-profile case reported across the national media a few years back. Emilio Gonzalez had Leigh syndrome, a neurometabolic disorder, and the providers thought that it was appropriate to stop treatment for Emilio. His mother, Katerina, would not agree, thought that only Jesus would take him. They had many, many conferences. None of those are actually required by the statute, but they're often held, and they could not reach any consensus. So they served a letter telling Katerina that there's going to be an ethics committee meeting to discuss the treatment in her son's case. At least 40 hours later, they hold the ethics committee meeting. The ethics committee agrees with the physician. They usually do, not always, but they usually do. That decision's not reviewable, right? You can't go to court and say, oh, the ethics committee screwed up. That's not the right thing. Their decision is reduced to writing. This is just a snippet, right? They think that the burdens seriously outweigh the benefits. They give the written decision to Katerina, the surrogate. She now has 10 days to try to transfer Emilio to another facility. Almost never are these transfers possible, because for the same reason that the treating facility doesn't want to treat him, no other facility wants to treat him either. Plus, this is also a conflict-ridden case. If they don't transfer the patient, he's still there on the 11th day, then the facility can withdraw treatment unilaterally with no risk. So we might say, and I break this down in the good, the bad, and the ugly here, you might say that while the Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act gives us only a yellow light, the Texas Advanced Directives Act gives a green light, right? It's just in contrast, again, to the Ontario approach. This is good for all types of futility disputes. It doesn't specify any substantive triggers whatsoever. And it's been used many, many times, even in the face of serious press and media coverage, negative media coverage. And therefore, it's been recommended as a model, and it's perceived as a model for other states. Last year, the Idaho Senate unanimously passed a bill modeled on the Texas law. Connecticut just had a conference, considered the same thing. California Medical Association has adopted resolutions recommending the same thing. Washington State Medical Association. There's a conference coming up in a few weeks in Maryland. We're going to talk about the same thing. And I might note that in 2004, the Medical Society of Wisconsin unanimously accepted a resolution to introduce a legislative proposal modeled on the Texas policy. And while legislation was never introduced, it does remain the official position of the Medical Society. So the bad and the ugly. So we saw there's few substantive criteria for identifying inappropriate end-of-life treatment. And without substantive criteria, we have to resort to procedural criteria, right? We have no categories, no formulas, no algorithms. If we can't identify what is a right decision, then at least we can address how to reach that decision. But there's nothing wrong with pure process mechanisms, right? It's the best we can do in the face of incommensurable value conflict. But if process is all you have, then it has to have integrity and fairness. And I know we already voted on the Texas Act before, but I'm just twisting that question a little bit, which is not whether you want it or not, but do you perceive the Texas Advance Directive process to be fair? And I guess, maybe you don't agree there should be one at all, but assuming that there is one, is it sufficiently fair? All right. Somewhat fair. Many say it's somewhat fair, somewhat unfair. Okay. Some say it's quarters say it's very fair. Well, there have been much discussion about the procedural defects in the Texas Advance Directive Act. Including one of the authors has admitted it has serious defects, and there was substantial consensus in the legislature that they needed to repair some of the defects in the Act. And when I say due process, what I mean is there's a classic bundle of rights: notice, opportunity to present, opportunity to confront, assistance of counsel, an independent, neutral decision maker, a statement of decision with reasons, and judicial review. Right? This is the classic bundle. Criminal defendants get all of these. Might suggest that patients in Texas get none of them. Right? To be precise now, the statute itself does not afford them. Some hospitals may provide them in practice voluntarily, but many treat their legal obligations as a floor. I'm sorry, as a ceiling, not as a floor. Right? Now, we don't have time, of course, to go through all of these, but basically, providers should give patients what they give themselves. The more elaborate due process, everywhere from peer review processes involving restriction or revocation of privileges to adverse licensure actions. So I just want to focus just on two aspects of due process: the neutral decision maker and the statement of decision. So let me just start with the neutral decision maker. Who makes the final decision to stop life-sustaining medical treatment? The Intramural Institutional Ethics Committee. The Ethics Committee, however, is not independent, right? It's comprised of people who work at the hospital. Now, the Texas Act, oops, did I go too far? The Texas Act recognizes the need for an independent check, right? That's why it requires ethics committee review of the physician, right? It's not the physician herself. You at least have to have the ethics committee prove that. And it prohibits the referring physician from serving on the ethics committee. But it's not clear that even this is still enough, because the Texas Advance Directives Act has given power to the Ethics Committee without demanding accountability in return. It's entirely silent on the composition of the Ethics Committee. Right? A 2007 study in critical care medicine found that only one half of Texas Texas committees had 5 or fewer members, most had 10 or fewer, and most were not very multidisciplinary. There's no community member requirement, as there is for IRBs, and fewer than 10% of Texas ethics committees had a community member, right? So these are all 100% insiders. Now, maybe giving power to the ethics committee did not seem odd in 1999 when the act was passed and signed by George Bush, but it sure seems odd today after significant inquiry and discussion of conflicts of interest from the pharmaceutical and device manufacturers and all the anti-kickback and stark enforcement that's been going on. And there's no doubt that money often sits at the ethics committee table, sometimes literally in the form of the utilization manager. And money sometimes seems to drive some futility cases, especially where coverage has been exhausted. And even apart from money, it's sometimes hard for the ethics committee member in these situations to be sufficiently objective and tough. In fact, your own Chief Justice Abramson, in the Edna MF case, specifically wrote a special concurring opinion in that case to chastise the Ethics Committee for acting in a pure liability protecting role instead of acting in the role that an Ethics Committee ought to have been acting in. The other aspect of due process that I want to quickly discuss is the statement of decision, right? And the idea behind here is that if you have to write up your decision, provide a rationale, provide a basis for the decision, right? It demonstrates that the decision has been considered, deliberated, and is well supported. The Texas Act requires a statement of decision, but it doesn't give any standards or specifications, and the decisions are of highly variable quality. In the Emilio Gonzalez case I mentioned a second ago, Seton Hospital in Austin wrote 2 very careful reports, totaling over 20 pages, laying out the facts and reasoning. In contrast, in the more recent case of Maurice Davis, Memorial Hermann in Houston wrote this cover letter, basically saying the committee has found life-sustaining treatment to be medically inappropriate. Why was it medically inappropriate? Look at the attached documentation. This is it. The decision here is recorded on a pre-printed form. It only contains 3 fields: background, intervention under review, and conclusion, right? There's no room for reasons, for explanation. Why is the treatment inappropriate? And there's no room for it. None is provided. The Texas Act is silent, not only on the substantive criteria, but also on the procedures and methodology. Silent in everything from the quorum and voting requirements in the Ethics Committee to what the written decision has to look like or even address. And again, just to note, the other thing that Justice Abramson chastised the Ethics Committee in Edna MF case for was lack of